Hello and welcome to Timewalking Gearing 101. This is a hopefully short video giving you a rough outline of how, in general terms, you want to gear for content that scales down and normalizes your gear, such as in Timewalking and Mage Tower. This is something people have a lot of questions about, and quite often the questions people ask reveal a kind of fundamental misunderstanding of how it all works. So what I want to do is talk about the fundamentals first, so that when gearing, you can understand why a piece of gear is or isn't good. But before that, there's an even fundamental question people tend to ask, which is, why would you do this? There's a common reaction people have to hearing about timewalking optimization along the lines of, actually, I feel I can manage timewalking in my normal gear. In fact, it's pretty easy. And this betrays a kind of misunderstanding of what we're trying to accomplish here. We're talking about timewalking not as a means to just run 5 dungeons and get a lucrative piece of normal raid loot, but as an end in itself, something done for its own sake. And this applies not just to timewalking content, but even to the process of gearing. So, with that in mind, there's 2 main parts to what can make this fun. Number 1, big numbers. Optimizing your DPS is rewarding in much the same way as it is for max level core content. You clear content faster, you have an easier time of a challenge like Mage Tower, you can get pretty good XP carrying friends through dungeons, and you get to see a bigger number beside your name on details than other people. If you're asking, but why is that good? Then you need to be watching a more philosophical video than this one. I'm going to assume from here on that you can appreciate seeing big numbers. So number 2 is the farming. This one's pretty debatable as everyone loves to complain about farming, but I'd argue that if you're playing a game like World of Warcraft, you've sort of revealed preference for enjoying the grind to get better gear. Otherwise, there's lots of games out there where you don't need to do that. But I'd also argue that farming timewalking gear is in some ways more enjoyable than keeping up with current gearing. You get to play around in old raids and dungeons that are normally completely forgotten, and work with old professions that you thought you'd never use again. Also, the gear you collect is far more perennial than your current gear that gets replaced in entirety each season. Gear you get that's good for timewalking might be good forever. So, assuming you're still on board here, the next thing we want to know is, what is timewalking gear? The most basic answer I can give is that it is the gear that is most powerful for its item level above a certain item level threshold. That doesn't really mean a whole lot in itself, so let's start with what timewalking is. In timewalking, and in other similar content such as Mage Tower, both your character level and the item level of your gear is scaled down to a set value. For example, in Legion Timewalking and in Mage Tower, your character level is dropped to 45, and the item level of your gear is dropped to 120. Gear below item level 120 will be unchanged, but anything above that will drop down while keeping its relative proportionate stat values. That is to say, item level above 120 conveys no advantage, but gear that is any way better than average for its item level retains this advantage. And to be clear, nothing scales up, so gear below 120 will be at a disadvantage. For each expansion showcased in Timewalking, there's a different item level threshold, the highest so far being Legion at 120. So the ideal piece of Timewalking gear is at least 120, but gear below that might still be useful in lower brackets, and some particularly strong gear might be good even if the item level seems too low. The thresholds tend to be inclusive enough that any gear from that previous expansion or later ought to at least be viable, but there's still a ton of exceptions. Again, what we specifically want is gear that is above average for its item level. For a piece of gear to be above average, this means that it confers extra stats or other bonuses relative to some baseline for that item level. This is commonly referred to as an item's budget. This is easiest to observe in current gear, where for the most part, if you look at, say, an item level 415 belt, it's going to have the same amount of primary stats, armor, stamina, and secondary stats as any other item level 415 belt. The specific secondaries and distribution might be very different, but the amount would almost certainly be the same. Now, if we found a 415 belt that had more secondaries than other belts, or perhaps the same amount of secondaries but an additional special effect, we would call these extras out of budget. If the belt were scaled down to item level 120, it would still be better than those other belts were they also scaled down to 120. Let's start with the simplest example. Take that same bog standard 415 belt. If you add a socket, it's the same item level, but now you can add a gem and it will have all the stats it normally has, but also the stats from that gem. Now, when you consider that the actual item level of the piece doesn't matter because it's getting scaled down to, say, 120 in Mage Tower, that means the item with a socket is automatically better than the same item with even a way higher item level, simply because it has more stats per item level. But that's just the most basic example because some items offer way more than just a bit of extra stats from a gem. Probably the most extreme example, to the point of which it's kind of in a category beyond just over budget, is the Heart of Azeroth. This was the centerpiece of your gear in BFA, and while it doesn't work in current content, or in Mage Tower for that matter, it absolutely functions in Timewalking. This one piece of gear, aside from offering a reasonable amount of stats, gives you a selection of powerful passive and active abilities, and a huge amount of stamina to boot. It's so strong that even in Shadowlands, despite being way behind an item level, it was the best piece of gear you could equip anywhere it wasn't explicitly disabled, and in Timewalking you get to use it as if it was on level. Now, it's not always going to be quite so obvious when a piece of gear is better. For example, a really common trap people fall into is older primary stat rings. If you compare a ring from, say, Warlords of Draenor to one from Battle for Azeroth, it's not immediately clear which is going to be better once they're scaled down. They both have the potential to be socketed, so nothing is missing there. But there's a big difference in that older rings include a specific primary stat. Now, this seems great at first glance, like a good rule of thumb for most classes is primary stat is worth maybe double of a secondary stat in terms of overall DPS. One ring has it and one ring doesn't. The BFA rings of course has more stats, but only because it's higher item level, which won't matter, right? Well, maybe. When they're the same item level, we see that the BFA ring still has more secondary stats. A lot more, in fact. It's missing some points in int, but has more secondaries, about 3 times as many points as it's missing in int. So the BFA ring ends up being the better choice here. This is actually going to be applicable to every primary stat ring, they're just generally much lower budgeted than rings are these days. If you want a takeaway from this, it's that unless you're really putting the work in, you're probably best off just leaning on a guide to gear. With item level not being so directly meaningful, we're effectively considering all gear through the history of the game, so there's just an astronomical amount of options to look at. However, understanding why the theory crafters working on this made the choices they did will help you better prioritize what to work on, and maybe let you come up with a viable second choice when you just can't get your hands on that better option. So, a couple other notes before we get into the more practical part of the guide. Firstly, enchants and enhancements to items. Different enchantments require different item level minimums and maximums, so there are in fact cases where the same item may be better or worse at a different pre-scaled item level because of what enchants can be used on it. Unfortunately, at the time I'm recording this, those item level thresholds were not changed with the scaling changes in Dragonflight, which means the vast majority of old enchants in the game are just unusable past item level 50. I won't get into detail for the newer relevant enchants as this is supposed to be a 101 video, but something to keep in mind if you see a suggestion elsewhere for a specific enchant to be used. Secondly, I want to make special mention of the legacy tag on a lot of old items. I've kind of left this for late in the video as it's a bit of a buzzkill, but the fact is that a huge amount of old gear with fancy effects has been hit with this legacy label, which means those effects simply don't function anywhere for any content. You still get the stats from it, and some are still quite good for that reason, but don't expect to throw on your old tier gear from past expansions and have it do anything interesting. With that out of the way, let's get on to what is hopefully the fun part, actually getting the gear. Well, maybe actually doing time walking is the fun part, but if you don't enjoy this part at least somewhat, you're probably in the wrong place. Your first step ought to be to look at the best in slot list for what spec or classes you want to try gearing. There's going to be gear from a lot of different sources. Some of it is easy, some of it not, some of it really impactful, and some of it just nice to have. This part of the video will be about getting a sort of game plan together as far as what to prioritize and how. I'm going to try and be relatively undetailed about everything, as there's probably an entire guide's worth of stuff to talk about for each category of item, and I am still trying to keep this 101. Specific guides probably already exist, but if you feel what's out there for specific guides is lacking, just hassle me enough and I'll probably make one or two. First and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, is that Heart of Azeroth. I'm sorry if you hated BFA, but this is a bit of a time investment, and it is worth it. A lot of specs use Azerite gear, for which the heart is required, and even if you don't, this is just a very strong item. Don't feel you have to do it all at once, but long term, you want to get it and level it up. Bear in mind, even though I'd call the heart priority, the grind is probably going to take you at least a few weeks, and there's no reason not to, at the same time, start farming other stuff that might be on weekly lockouts. So the general approach here is that you go through the story quests from BFA that both grant you the heart and level it up a great deal. You can skip the war campaign stuff, but you want to do the Nazjatar intro as it served as a level catch-up for the heart. Then you'll eventually get coerced into the legendary cape quest line. Typically you'll also want this cape for time walking, and it needs to be leveled up too, so this ends up being an ideal way to get incidental levels for your Heart of Azeroth. You go through the cape quest line, sorry, it's very long, and when you're done that you farm coalescing visions from the weekly N'Zoth assaults in Uldum or Pandaria. You use this currency to run horrific visions to get levels for your cape up to rank 12, and by the end of this, your heart will probably be at least level 80 from the assault dailies, which is high enough to give you all the benefits. And you'll also have accumulated a bunch of Echoes of Nyalotha from running horrific visions, which can be used to purchase any Heart of Azeroth powers that you've previously unlocked on your account. I'm not going to get into unlocking the powers in this video. That'll be something for you to look into with regards to what you actually want for your class. With the neck and the cape out of the way, the next most meaningful piece of gear for a lot of specs is going to be Azerite gear. If you look at a best in slot list, they're going to show specific pieces, but really what you're after is specific traits, and maybe not just what was good in BFA, as this gear has been mangled with all kinds of scaling changes. The other thing to watch for is that you want gear that has the max amount of traits. That's 4 rings, not counting the center circle. At the moment, this means gear from raids, starting with Battle for Dazar'alor, gear from emissary caches, gear from heroic Darkshore warfronts, and from some world bosses. A lot of legacy gear, like from dungeons, might be good too, but be careful both with old and new gear that the item level is higher than the time walking bracket you're going into. Some of it will be scaled up to the new Dragonflight item levels, some won't, and some will be fine even if it hasn't. Getting all the gear on your best in slot list might seem daunting, especially for stuff that's grandfathered or from emissaries and world bosses on a long rotation, but my advice here is not to let perfect be the enemy of good. Wowhead's still got their Azerite trait finder. I'll put a link in the description for that one. And it may be easy to find a few alternatives that, for example, have both the major traits you want and maybe just a suboptimal minor trait. Something like that. There's lots of options out there. Just check your in-game guide and see if it's a useful item level and has all the rings before you spend a bunch of time farming. The guide should be accurate in this particular case. Next, we're going to talk about trinkets. This is, of course, a super diverse category that's going to be wildly different from a lot of classes, but I'll try and hit some highlights. As a warning, there's no good rule of thumb for just looking at a trinket and knowing at a glance if it's any good. There's really no substitute for just relying on research others have put in, as a lot comes down to non-obvious information like procs per minute and weird scaling quirks. First, as I want to mention this one as soon as possible, if you're a character that does melee or ranged attacks, you almost certainly want the Dragonspine trophy from Gruul. This offers an absurd haste bonus with ridiculous uptime, and it's dead easy to farm. Gruul's has 2 bosses and takes minutes to do. Just start farming this every week. Pause the video, go do it now if you didn't know. Okay. Good choice for ranged casters is the Unblinking Gaze of Seth, which drops in Hellfire Citadel. It's got a great damage proc with an extremely low internal cooldown, does a ton of damage. Now, more generally, an interesting and usually powerful choice is the so-called Siege of Orgrimmar trinkets. This refers to the trinkets from Siege of Orgrimmar that have this confusing mess of a tooltip saying a bunch of stuff is increased by 1 or 2%. This is misleading for 2 reasons. Firstly, it is a 10% bonus. Yeah, the tooltip's off by a little bit. Second, it's a percent of your rating, not a percent bonus like most things that deal with percent of a secondary stat. As in, it doesn't give you 10% haste, but if you have 100 points of haste, it gives you 10 points of haste. Then on top of all that, you get a primary stat bonus. It's like a regular trinket with that crazy stat bonus thrown on. These are disabled in Mage Tower, but fantastic for time walking. A popular Mage Tower option is the Ravaged Seed Pod. This does good damage, and like Dragonspine Trophy, it's quite easy to get. It comes from the first boss of Emerald Nightmare, and you can very quickly make 4 attempts per week because there's 4 difficulties. These are just a few prominent examples. I strongly advise you to look at the guides and see what works for you. Again, this is a complicated category where many trinkets are good for many different reasons, so just don't make blind assumptions here. Now, I want to mention Dragonflight gear here. I wasn't sure where to put this, as I wanted to kind of order what I talked about by priority. And getting current gear is either trivial, like for your main, you already have it, or really annoying on an alt that you really only care about gearing for time walking or Mage Tower, or just play casually in general. That said, some of the gear that's best for normal max level content right now is also the best for time walking. This includes tier bonus gear, with many specs wanting either 2 or 4 piece bonuses, and some gear with embellishments, particularly in slots that lack other good options. Primal Storm gear as well is often an easy, if not best, option. I think tier gear is worth a special consideration, as while you'd normally consider it in terms of current content, it might end up being good in time walking in later seasons, like maybe a class that right now wants 4 piece plus 1 Azerite piece, will later use 2 piece plus 2 piece of next season's tier plus an Azerite piece. If you have the opportunity, consider acquiring tier gear with tertiaries and a socket for Helm, as that will be much, much harder to get in later seasons when the tier isn't current. For trinkets, if you are considering using current trinkets, maybe don't. Unless they're outright bugged to not scale down, which does happen from time to time, they're probably vastly outcompeted. It should be said, though, for current gear in general, it won't become bad per se in time walking, just potentially bad relative to other options. Adding a few high priority items will still be a huge boost, even if a lot of your gear is just your regular gear. The last major category I want to discuss is gear from Chromie Time. This refers to gear obtained within the pre-60 system, wherein your loot will be scaled to the level at which you acquire it, usually from dungeons. This is a little complicated to get, but not as complicated as some people think. I'll try and give a short version, as again this could easily be a whole guide, but the basic idea is you either loot this gear while you yourself are a lower level, or you have a lower level character loot it and trade it to you. A typical setup would be you party with a lower level character in Chromie Time, enter a normal dungeon. The dungeon will be on level for them, but still trivial for you, and each boss will then drop you each a piece of legacy loot, that is to say anything on the loot table. Gear you get on your 70 will be low item level and probably useless, but whatever drops for the lower level character will actually be a higher item level, scaled up to match their current level. There are lots of high value pieces, namely from Burning Crusade dungeons, that you can get at item levels higher than 120 this way. And just be aware that item budgets are all over the place, so again, as with everything I mentioned, don't take this to mean Chromie Time Gear is automatically good. It just means that good, high stat budgeted pieces can be made usable when they'd otherwise be too low. I stress again, check your best in slot lists. Alright, at this point, being as I said this was supposed to be a short video, and having seen that timecode past the 20-minute mark, I think I'll wrap this up. Hopefully this has given you a general sense of what it might mean to optimize your gear for time walking, and you feel like going out there and farming. I'm going to leave a bunch of relevant links in the description so you can do some homework there. Questions in the comments are welcome, but again, please check out the Discord as there's plenty of people there who will be well equipped to help you get started. In conclusion, time walking is a land of contrasts. Thank you for listening.